I'm Jay, founder at TechForce, and as the saying goes, if you want something get done quickly, ask the laziest person in the room, right? Being the laziest person in this room, what would I look for when I'm looking to hack into your systems, your company, right? I would be usually looking for new employees starting. Are you making any new announcements on LinkedIn? Your company news, any of your senior staff on holiday, who can I spend the phishing emails, and all that, right? If you ask, I'm sure you all know the stats. I don't have to bore you with the stats, but if you ask all the successful cybersecurity breaches, where do they start? 90% of them start from a phishing email, right? That's the low-hanging fruit and easy for a lazy guy like me, right? So if you go a bit further, does anybody in the room know how the LastPass breach has happened? Last year? No? Exactly. So one of the LastPass DevOps engineer had a Plex TV software running on his personal laptop, which he is using for the business. And the attackers used the information from a previous breach and launched the attack through that vulnerability, and they got the keys to the kingdom, right? How many of you know what software your employees are running now, especially with the employees being remote and working from anywhere? Do you know all the software they're running on their laptops? Very good. 1, 2. We got about 120 people. 2 is like what, 1.759% or something? Right, cool, that's me. With that note, I will leave you with my amazing colleague, Holly Grace Williams. So, thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name's Holly Grace. I now, thanks to Jay, have 20 minutes to get through my entire story. And really, that's all that I want to do. I want to talk to you about a story. It's a recent engagement that I've done as the work, and I thought it was interesting enough to share with you. The takeaway here is this is just one story and one thing that's gone wrong. So if, as I'm talking through the details, you go, that would never happen on our network, I'm not saying it would. I'm not saying this is cutting-edge research. It was just a funny thing that happened during an engagement that I thought either some people in the room would learn from and other people in the room might do what I did, which is laugh about the fact that it happened. So just because we've got a mixed audience, I will very quickly do some introductions and explain my terms and things like that. So some people will get frustrated that I'm going to give you the definition of what I think a red team is, because that will be very, very basic to them, but just so that everybody's on the same level. And then I'll build up and talk to you about this company that I hacked and why I think it was funny. Before I get into that, my name's Holly Gressel. I'm a penetration tester. Somebody asked me today, the hell is that? I break into computers for a living. That's the easiest way that I found to summarize it. I do physical access testing and things like that as well, but that's the core focus, break into things for a living. Part of the reason that I start my presentations with this is my bias will come out throughout this presentation. I know people look at cybersecurity from all different directions. Maybe you're looking at it from governance and you spend a lot of time reading and writing policies, or maybe you're an auditor or something like that, and some of my bias is going to come out. All I really care about is whether a hack will be successful or not, whether I can compromise a system through a vulnerability. I don't care about like academic vulnerabilities and slight reducing of the key space and things like that. It's like, can I hack you with it or not? And in actuality, there's both sides to that. Sometimes the work that I do is very novel. I'll give you a very, very quick example of that. Usually when I go on site to a customer, I kind of give them a quick rundown of what we're going to do. We're going to try and hack some systems. We're going to escalate privileges. We're going to do a full takeover of your Active Directory domain, going through it as if I've said it 100 times before, because I have. And one organization I worked for, they were like, oh, actually, it's entirely a Linux estate. We haven't got any Windows at all, no Active Directory. It's like, oh, my, okay. I'm going to have to actually work for my money today. And in that particular test, I dropped 4 0 days, which is how that went, because there was nothing for me to go out apart from there was an old school KVM on the network. So I worked really hard and found 4 novel vulnerabilities. So sometimes it's cool things like that. And as Jay said in the introduction, very often a lot of what we do is just guess passwords and stuff. And the fact of the matter is, I don't really care if I compromise your network because somebody had test 1, 2, 3, 4, or we're running a vulnerable Plex server, or if I'm dropping orders. It's like, if I can hack you, I'm going to hack you, and that's the thing that I enjoy the most. So very often when we're talking about organizations from a pen testing focus, and I do a lot of presentations like this talking about pen testing, we're to some degree talking about these topics. And of course, Jay has covered these, and I'm sure every other speaker today has covered these to some degree. So one of the things that I want to talk about is organizations increasing their maturity past just plain pen testing. A lot of organizations I work for, and don't get me wrong, it's an easy life for me. I go on site with the customer and I'm like, hey, I'm here to do the pen test, and they go, great, there is this cupboard for you to sit in for the next week, or maybe it's a meeting room or something like that. I sit down in the meeting room, I do a pen test, we get to Friday, I say, pen test all done, you'll get your report next week, and I leave. And that's fine, because like I say, it's an easy life for me. But I would like to think that some organizations are trying to build up more of a conversation with the pen tester that they have and trying to get more out of that engagement than just pen testing. Everybody will have a different approach to that. Talk to CISOs and senior leaders within cyber about how they would like to get more out of their pen testers. They'll give you different answers, but this is just one story of one way that it can go well. So one of the things that I like to try and build up with organizations is what happens next after the breach. So generally when it comes to pen testing, we go in, we try and hack them. If we're successful, we write a report about how we were successful, and then they spend the next several weeks repairing those vulnerabilities, fixing those holes, that kind of thing. But nobody ever talks to us about like how well they were able to detect the attacks that we're doing, how well they were able to understand the context of the actions that we were performing. Some people will disagree with me on this because they'll say, well, no, that's what a purple team engagement is for. And before I get into that, I'll define a couple of terms so that everybody is on the same level. But the point that I'm going to try and make is the jump up to a true red team and the jump up to a true purple team is a very big one. And you can start moving in that direction with small steps. You don't have to go from basic pen test, or even worse, basic vulnerability scan, where somebody comes in and clicks go in a scanner, up into a full, true purple team. So just so that there's people who read policies for a living understand the words that I'm using, and those who are new to cyber and all of that, sorry, compliance guys, it's a cheap joke. I'll define the terms as I see them. People will disagree with these definitions, that's fine, but this is how I'm using these terms. When I talk about penetration testing, I'm talking about a human-led, scope-restricted, time-limited security assessment. So I go and sit in the cupboard for the week. It's time-limited because I'm on site for a week. I'm scope-restricted in terms of an organization typically has a specific thing that they would like me to hack. So this, for example, could be, oh, we're releasing a new version of our mobile application. Can you please look for vulnerabilities in our new version of our mobile application? Scope-restricted in that way. And it's human-led in terms of I am doing the hacking. I'm not just clicking go in a scanner. So this is distinct from what I would call a true red team in a couple of major ways. The first being, I've removed scope restricted and written multi-technique. For me, for it to be a true red team, we must be using technical, physical, and social attacks. So it's not just coming in and hacking things, but I should be able to call staff members up and try and coerce them into giving me information, credentials, performing actions on my behalf. And I should be able to perform physical access testing of office space. I'm not talking about physical access testing today, but if you want to derail me in the question section of the panel and talk about that because it's cool, that's fine. I'll just say that it's not dressing up like a ninja and rappelling in from the ceiling. It's just another social engineering attack. I'm probably going to try and talk my way in. Everybody always asks, like, what disguises do you wear on physical access testing? I'm like, employee? Anyway. Multi-technique, those three techniques, and the assessing team should be choosing which technique is used. The second part is we're intending to assess an organization's response to a real-world attack. So it's not just do vulnerabilities exist, but it's would you be able to determine if an attacker was able to leverage those? And it's in the latter part that I want to talk today, and very often in the latter part that I think organizations struggle, and sometimes organizations think they're doing better in that area than they are. And there's a funny story that will explain some of that. So when I go on site and I'm doing an infrastructure assessment, I'm going to either plug into an exposed network port and take a look at what could a guest, visitor, or contractor access, or I might be sitting down at a staff member's device, like a corporate device, and looking at what could a malicious insider do, that kind of thing. Assessing an internal network, I'm going to perform broadly these steps. Sometimes we get hacking set to easy mode, and there's a really easy vulnerability that allows us to skip some of these steps. For example, if you remember when the WannaCry vulnerability, if I can call it that, or MS17010, or Eternal Blue, or whatever name you prefer for that vulnerability, when that vulnerability came out, we could skip all of these steps and get system access on a device straight away. So it's not that I'm following through every one of these steps, but broadly speaking, these are the actions that I'm going to perform when I do a penetration test. And generally speaking, I walk through these things, I get to the end, I find some vulnerabilities, I write a report, and I go send the report to the customer. But the thing that I want to highlight is whilst this jump from just a basic pen test where we come in and find some security vulnerabilities, and we're generally sitting with the IT team and everybody is aware that a test is happening, up to a true red team where the IT team shouldn't know that the test is taking place. It's multi-techniques. It might be hacking. It might be social engineering. There's lots of things going on. And possibly the SOC has, or the security team, the defensive team, have no visibility of what's happening, and they're trying to hunt down these attackers. There's a big middle ground there in terms of your observability of how much you understand of the attack taking place. So some of the questions that organizations should be looking to answer when an attack is happening, regardless of whether this is a pen test in progress, something like a full red team engagement, or something like an actual security breach, is these kinds of questions. And I've put these in the first person here saying, what level of access do I have? Because that's the perspective I'm usually working with organizations. But from the company's point of view, it might be like, what accounts have been compromised? What servers have been compromised? Those kinds of things. And very often, organizations struggle with these things. So I mentioned an assessment that I did with an organization recently. And this is not a full red team. It was just hacking. And it was, what they were trying to do is effectively, in fact, I'll give you the short story version. They got breached a little while ago now. They got breached about 20 months ago. And the organization basically took the stance that we will not let this happen again. But you can imagine, as a CISO, if anyone works in a security team, the day after you have been breached, when no doubt your network is in absolute shambles, even if you take the moral stance of like, we will fix this, we will make sure this never happens again, you have your work cut out for you. One of the things that they found out, thanks to the breaches, they had PII just everywhere on their network. So one of the first activities is just like cleaning all of that up, sorting out privileges. They had user accounts, normal staff members, and then they had admin accounts, and everyone in the IT team was basically a domain admin, and all of this fundamental stuff that no doubt everybody else has talked about today. So in that position, and they started trying to tie things down. So when I started working with them, what they were effectively looking at doing was, can I come in, perform a security assessment, and then can their SOC present on the actions that I'm performing as I go to give the company confidence that that SOC is able to detect those activities. This is not a true red team in the sense that I'm not doing social engineering and physical and all of that kind of thing. And also it's not truly hidden in terms of like, they don't have any communication for what I'm doing. In fact, there was what I think it was a mistake that was made, but it was something that was happened. The IT manager told the SOC, not that an engagement was going to occur, but they were like, oh yeah, Monday the 9th, we're having a security assessment done. So you can imagine me getting to work at 9 a.m. on Monday the 9th, like, how am I supposed to go undetected? Like, they know that I'm coming. And this engagement, as it turned out, as I'll talk through in these slides, went really, really badly. And the SOC were ultimately had a real difficult time detecting the actions that I was able to do, which is good. That's my job, is going undetected in that way. But equally, one of the things that came out from that I wanted to talk about in this presentation is the SOC could tell a lot of the things that I had done, but could not answer two questions about those activities. Was the action successful? And why did I perform that action? And it's those two things that I think an awful lot of organizations struggle with. However you perform that monitoring assessment, so you might do something like atomic red teaming, as some people call it. Atomic red teaming, if you've not come across this term, is effectively performing specific TTPs. So let's launch a password guessing attack and see if the SOC detect the password guessing attack. So it's very, very specific. One action, look for a detection. It's a great way of testing your monitoring, and it's really contained, very quick assessments, right up to, like we say, full engagement. But the SOC detected some of the activities that I was able to do, but couldn't work out why I'd done them. And it made for a really interesting purple team where they thought they'd done a really good presentation at the end, where they were like, here is a timeline of the attacker's activity. And they weren't able to say why I'd done things. And more importantly, there was attacks that they had detected, but weren't sure if they had succeeded or not. So context matters, every engagement's different, and there's a lot of complexity with these kinds of things. But the way that it started was, and for the sake of brevity, this was a few engagements. It was 3 engagements with this organization and kind of cramming into one very short story. So things changed over time, and I found lots of vulnerabilities that were then remediated. But at one point, I gained access to a Citrix environment. So I was able to grab myself a password, log into a Citrix environment, and effectively just be at a desktop that a staff member was at. It was still quite restricted in a couple of different ways. For example, this Citrix desktop did not have internet access. To get internet access, so if you open Chrome, it would pop up and ask you to authenticate to their proxy, and that would require multi-factor authentication. So my attack had been successful, and I got desktop access, but I didn't have complete access. So it was still somewhat restricted. But when it comes to understanding, how far an attacker is getting and why an attacker is performing certain actions and what the attacker's up to, context really matters. And for these guys, they'd put an awful lot of effort into strongly restricting what a user was able to do. So I logged into Citrix, and I basically couldn't run anything. So I'm just like, oh, let's see what happens. And bearing in mind, I've been working with this company for a while, and my first engagement with them, and I wanted to get hacking tools on their system, it's just like open PowerShell, download hacking tools in PowerShell, and click go. Because right at the beginning of this kind of campaign of tests with them, that was the state that they're at. But by this stage, you open Start menu, you try and run CMD, blocked. Try and run Registry Editor, blocked. Try and run PowerShell, blocked. And one of the things that happened during this process is I'm kind of like mapping where their restrictions are. So I'm trying to execute PowerShell, that's blocked. I'm trying to execute CMD, and that's blocked. And all the while, the red team, the SOC team, like watching me and trying to work out where am I on the network, what am I up to, those kinds of things. So it wasn't the case that I could just like download hacking tools or download Metasploit or something like that, because I would probably be detected. So I'm trying to do things in a little bit of a sneaky way and see what I can get access to. So a couple of things, just in case you're unfamiliar with them, that can allow access when you've got some restricted access. One is what we call living off the land. So living off the land is making use of things like Microsoft's built-in tools. There are whole presentations on lolbins, and they're fantastic. If you're not monitoring for lolbin execution, you are missing quite a big part of security. But what this is looking for files within Microsoft systems that we can leverage to give us access. So for example, this example on the slide is just a way of executing a binary. So for files looks to see if a file exists. So it's checking for the presence of Notepad. If Notepad exists, it executes the command mstsc, which is used for opening remote desktop. So not a complex example, but just this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Or there's others, for example, where we can supply a DLL file to a lolbin, and it will execute the code within the DLL file. So it's code execution, and sometimes quite subtle code execution. When I say sometimes, I mean if they're not looking for lolbins, then lolbin execution will go unnoticed. So I found things like this. I was able to execute some commands. I was able to access some things that should have been restricted. If I try and run PowerShell within the Start menu, it won't work. It's just told it's blocked, but I can get command execution via this kind of sideways access mechanism here. And another thing I was able to do, which is just really funny, is I was able to execute two things in this screenshot. The first is Visual Basic scripts. So I can execute Visual Basic on Windows PC because it exists by default. And I was able to use Visual Basic to access WMI. If you don't know what WMI is, don't worry, unless you're really old, and then you probably just don't remember. WMI first came around like Windows 95. It was pre-installed on Windows 2000. It's Windows management instrumentation. It allows you to access Windows APIs and do things like execute commands remotely and things like that. So it's really useful for an attacker. There are two things that I can do here. One is effectively I could load my malicious code onto their systems using something like a DLL that I've written in C# and then execute it through lolbins. Or I could write my tooling in Visual Basic and execute it directly within this interface, those kinds of things. One of the reasons that I mentioned this, it was just really funny to me at the time. This highlighted two weaknesses with their SOC detection. One was effectively an over-reliance on looking for like malicious tooling. So they were basically waiting for the antivirus to alert, and then they would go and investigate that antivirus alert. And because I'm using just effectively like a feature of Windows, it's not malicious in nature, so their tooling, whatever they were particularly using, isn't flagging on it. And also it seemed that they were unfamiliar with what WMI was. So if anyone had incidentally spotted it, executions within the logs, that kind of thing, they didn't know what it was, so they didn't flag it. I don't have the specific details because I wasn't standing in the SOC at the time, but I do think what happened is basically an alert was generated for WMI execution. That went to a SOC Tier 1 analyst who didn't know what it was, Googled it, found loads of pages on Microsoft.com saying it's a Microsoft feature, and they closed the ticket. I assume that's what happened, or the alternative, of course, is just it went undetected. Either way, from my perspective, no action. So I continue on my journey. And there was a bunch of vulnerabilities that I found. I won't cover all of the details here. For example, I gained access to one of their web applications because there was a test account with test1234. There's always stuff like that somewhere in a pen test. Within the web application, I could code execution on the web server because there was a file upload vulnerability. There was weaknesses between the DMZ and the corporate network. The firewall wasn't quite correctly configured, that kind of thing. So a whole bunch of things that I found. And I started stepping through my methodology. And by that point, I had access to a few user accounts, and I was able to map the network. Although I didn't have like hacking tools like Metasploit or anything like that, I could build things in either Visual Basic I showed, or I could build things in C# and then execute them and perform my network mapping. So I'm doing like port scanning and all of that kind of thing as you'd expect. And then I stumbled across a network file share that I protected some of the details of the slide to protect the organization, but it's something along the lines of like scanner output or Xerox files or something like that. You know, there's just like a folder on the network somewhere that's just absolutely full of scans of documents. A whole bunch of, these are passports that I've selected as just a good example for this kind of thing. But there's also like things in there, utility bills and all kinds of things. Basically things that people have been scanning have been dropped on the network, and birth certificates and all kinds of things. So I'm working through this methodology, and I find this data that I want to steal from their environment. So I got effectively, it's about 4 gigabytes of PII, and I want to steal that from the network. But I mentioned I didn't have access to the internet, so I wasn't able to just like upload it to Dropbox or something like that. So what I did was I executed certutil. Does anyone know what this command is intending to do? Everybody laughed at the SOC earlier for not knowing what WMI is, and now nobody's brave enough to put their hand up and say what this command is doing. That's interesting. It's a very, very basic thing. What it is, within their Citrix environment, I couldn't download files from Citrix, and I couldn't upload them to the internet. But what I could do was copy and paste things, text from Citrix to my desktop. So what I did was I got the files that I was trying to steal, in this case a whole bunch of passports. I ran them through certutil, which is a file that you might guess from the -encode. Base64 encodes it. So I copied and pasted 4 gigabytes of PII out of their network onto my laptop and effectively performed the engagement. I managed to steal the data that they were trying to protect, and that was very, very bad for them. And then when we sat down and we had this debrief, like this purple team debrief, like I mentioned, this was one of the things that the SOC presented on. So effectively what they did was they presented on, we found this malicious activity. You know, some of it could just be end users being end users and like clicking bad links on the internet and trying to download files and things like this, but this is the activity that we have seen across this timeline. And there was 2 things that stood out. One of them was I performed a credential extraction attack. So I did this in a couple of different ways, but you can imagine things like trying to extract the local user accounts from a server that I compromised. Performed that attack. I used a tool that I'd written to do that, wrote in C# as mentioned earlier, and I did some other stuff with the domain controller in terms of credential extraction. And they mentioned that I'd performed this action, like credential extraction. But then they said, and our tool report killed and quarantined. So their antivirus had detected the attack take place, and it had killed the process that I had, this DLL that I mentioned earlier, and it quarantined it, so they stuck it away in the antivirus shell. But one of the things that they weren't able to answer was the attack successful or not? And all they could rely on was their tooling said, well, killed and quarantined, so we assume no. But it was successful. I had extracted those credentials. And then those credentials and all of those passports I extracted. And they mentioned the certutil. It's like one of the accounts that we believe is owned by the red teamer performed this action, and then they carried on. Never really said why we'd done this. And of course, you now know this was the exfiltration from the network that we had performed. So that might sound like a really basic example, and in one way it is, but an awful lot of organizations, and I work with like a different company every week, an awful lot of organizations have this approach to security where they're not really testing their monitoring capability. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. I mentioned atomic red teaming, where we sit down and we try a specific TTP and see if that's detected. Or you can do something like this, where you perform a pen test or you perform a objective-led security test, something like that, and then you see can the SOC or can the monitoring team present on what it was that the attacker was up to. But the most important thing was it successful, and what does it mean to us? Because whilst they were able to detect some of the activities that had taken place, they weren't able to actually answer those key questions of, like, effectively, how far did the attacker get? And at one point, like I said, I did a few engagements with them, but at one point on one of the engagements, I accidentally downloaded Mimikatz onto one of the accounts that I compromised. It's a really long story. I can tell you later on if you're interested in how on earth I did that. If you've never come across Mimikatz before, it's a horrendous tool from a hacker's perspective. It's really, really powerful. And there is no legitimate purpose for it being on a network. So I downloaded Mimikatz. I was like, oh God, I've effectively copied the wrong tool up to the compromised box. Absolute amateur mistake on my part. They detected that, of course. Any antivirus worth its salt will detect Mimikatz very, very easily. They locked that account. and then took no further action in terms of like, what other accounts do I have access to? Because if you imagine, basic example again, but if you imagine if I do a brute force attack or something like that, I get a bunch of hits, so maybe scan 1,000 user accounts, maybe get 2 or 3. I'm going to use one of them to perform the actions of my attack, and I'm not going to touch the others. They're just there in case I need them. So if you lock one account and perform no further action in terms of what was the attacker able to access, they'll just log in again with a different account. So it's these questions here that we need to be able to answer when we're looking at monitoring capability. And I've talked about doing it through pen testing. I've talked about doing it through atomic red teaming and those kinds of things. But it could even be as simple as just like tabletop scenarios. Get your incident response plan out, sit down. There's some Twitter accounts out there I can share with people if they're interested, where they just tweet scenario ideas for like bad things that can occur on a network. Somebody's accidentally published a production password and things like that. Somebody's published to a Git repository one of your AWS keys, those kinds of things. And walk through those scenarios in terms of how would the organization actually respond? Because in my experience, organizations have a real high view of how well they think they would respond to a realistic scenario. And in my experience, it's either they're really good at one kind of scenario because it's something they've worried about, like they've absolutely nailed ransomware, but any other kind of attack would write them off. Or they think that they've got a good level of monitoring because the defensive team is able to detect activities, but what they're failing at is, why is the attacker doing that, and how far has the attacker made it? Those critical questions that we have on the slides there. So we should look through some of those things. And you need to be thinking about not only from a security testing, from a pen testing point of view, like obviously how vulnerable are your systems and how do we lock down those security vulnerabilities in the way that hopefully everybody is doing pen testing. I know it's a bit of a bias for the pen tester to tell you to do more pen testing, but hopefully everybody's doing pen testing. But also, what's next? How far can we take that? If you're at a level of maturity where you're doing full-on red teaming, fantastic, awesome. You don't need my help. Unless you want me to do a red team, because they're great fun. But if you're at that level of maturity, then awesome. But the vast majority of organizations aren't. And it doesn't mean that red teaming should be some unachievable goal, like every time you do a report to the board, you say, oh, well, we're building up maturity, we're building up maturity. There's things you can do in that interim ground between pen testing and red teaming to make sure that your monitoring capability is good. Something cool and technical like I showed, or something basic like getting the plan out and making sure it doesn't say silly things. One more thing on incident response plans. If you've never done incident response scenario testing, it'll probably go badly the first time you do it. So pick a scenario, like we get hit by ransomware. Great scenario an organization did with me once. They specifically requested it. I don't know why. I don't want to think too hard about it. But they said, we want to do a tabletop scenario where we sit down with our incident response plan and we go through the steps of what would happen if we fired our IT team manager and he started logging into things before we got him out of the building. Really difficult scenario to test, but it's one of the things that they were concerned about. So walking through those scenarios. And in my experience, the first time you do them, they go badly. But why do we do these tests? Because, of course, you build up capability, you build up maturity. These guys aren't going to get caught out by WMIC the second time around, are they? They've learned that lesson now. And you build up muscle memory. So you get faster at responding, and that's a huge part of it as well. And that's it. Any questions? I am perfectly on time, so if the event wants to kick me out and I take questions later, I won't feel bad about it.
No, you are absolutely perfectly on time, and you're the first person to do that today. It was well done. There will be a chance to ask questions of Holly, because there's a panel session at the end of the afternoon, if you fancy hanging on to that. I have one question to ask you just now while other people start coming in.
Go ahead.
Are you good at social engineering? And if so, what makes you good at social engineering?
I think one of the things with social engineering is it isn't a single thing. So I was talking to somebody this morning who works for a company who do physical access testing, and their physical access testing is dressing up like a ninja and rappelling in from the ceiling, and that's not the kind of work that I do, so I would struggle at that. But the kind of stuff that I do, talking my way past reception, pretending I'm a new starter in those, I've been very, very successful at that. So it depends on what it is. I'm not great on the phone. I'm a millennial. I don't like ringing people up and saying, can you reset my password? But I've been pretty successful in breaking into buildings, even if it has involved climbing in the odd window or two.
Okay, right. Holly, thank you very much for that. And Jay, thank you for introducing.
I am here.